All right, so for Django this week, you guys will have weeks 10 through 11. We'll go through the documentation and a little bit of the tutorial here today. You guys will have the midterm exam that's due on Sunday at midnight. And then next week, we will finish up with Django and get started on Mini Project 4. Just as a recap, make sure that your Mini Project 3 is also turned in this week on Sunday by midnight. All right. So Django is another web framework that was designed with a whole lot of pieces pre-built out. So it's very similar to Flask in some respects, but a lot of the things that we had to do manually in there are now pre-built out. And so what we're looking to do is we'll go through the tutorial, and then again, you guys will have a mini project that kind of swings off of that. I use Django quite a bit. I think I've talked about it several times in class. When I'm out doing this in industry or building any kind of web app anymore, it's almost always based around Django, unless it's very small, in which case I use Flask for that project. Like if I don't need a heavy database or it's not going to change a lot or not a lot of moving parts, then I would stick with Flask. Let's see, documentation wise, we're going to go through the tutorial and all that. It's listed right here. And if you come in here and look at the actual tutorial link, just make sure that actually runs. And that's actually the wrong tutorial. That's going to a very old tutorial. So let me update that link real quick. Get you here. It was nice when they used the latest tag and now they just go with the actual version number. So that will get you started on here. What's nice about this tutorial is it's going to build a basic poll application, kind of fitting with the polls coming up around the corner. But it's very simple in that regard. It's kind of like what we did with a blog, only now it's a polling situation where you can vote on some certain things. What's nice on the back end is it has a admin site that's kind of pre-built into the Django side. This allows you to add data and content or even view and see that content directly within the app itself. It's all baked into the admin side of things. So in Flask, you would have had to have built something for the back end so you could see all the results or everything that's in there. In Django, that's all kind of built in. So to get started in here, we want to go ahead and get Django installed and we'll start a project. I'm going to do this very similar to what I did on the Flask side. So I'll go out to GitHub and then let's create a new one. And we're going to call this the Django tutorial. 2020. All right. Let's see here. We'll add our README. We'll throw in a git ignore, making sure we use Python. And no license at this point. Okay. So we got our little quick app up here. Let's go ahead and launch up PyCharm. Very similar to what we did with Flask, you will be able to use this tutorial as kind of a starting point to get up and running. However, it does need to be different than the poll app, obviously. You'll want to use it as something you're doing there. So that's the end of that Flask one. Let's go ahead and load this up from our version control. And our GitHub and our Django tutorial. All right, great. We'll need to go ahead and create a interpreter. So let's go ahead and create a new one for this. And exclude any of the Microsoft Defender stuff. Now, what's great about the pro version of PyCharm is it does have all the Django niceties built into it. So hopefully you guys are using that version, not the community edition, as everybody in here should have that for free. You could do it all by hand. You just have to do a lot of the Django stuff via the command line and such. But you can definitely use the UI to make that a whole lot nicer. All right, looks like this should all be coming up. Beautiful. All right, so to get this up and going, let's go ahead and launch a terminal. And if we go back to our tutorial, the first thing we want to do is go ahead and get Django installed itself. So to do that, we want to make sure we're at least running on 6, as that's the version that was there and up and running. So let's do a pip install Django and make sure that we are getting version 6 when we do that. So you'll notice that when I did that pip install, I'm actually getting 5.2 coming out of there. Let's see if we can force it over to 6. It's a good question for that. I'll tell you what, we just won't fight it. So instead of using 6, let's go to 5.2, because that obviously is the main version supported for the current version of Python that we're running in there. So I'm going to update the tutorial and I'm going to update the documentation here. Let's see here. Sometimes it isn't always best to go to the latest version that's in there, especially when it jumps a major revision. That's probably why it's not the default in the pip repository at this point. It isn't the dev version. There is a specific version called dev, which will get you the latest and greatest out there. So we're going to end up using 5.2. Forgive me for saying 6 earlier. We'll use 5.2 as that is what is pulled in by pip here. And we can confirm that if we do our pip freeze greater than requirements dot text. And we look at our requirements, we can see that our Django is set to 5.2.7. So we should be good to go. All right, let's close that up. Let's go ahead and do a initial commit. Oh, yep, we got to change our get ignore. Forgot about that. Let's go down here and do that real quick. Save our idea file. Okay, so that cleans us up the way we're supposed to be. Let's go ahead and do a little AI magic. It's good. Push out our first one. Oops, I did not mean to set that globally. Darn it. Oh well. All right, we should be good. Let's double check out here. Just make sure the initial stuff is all working like it's supposed to. Looks good. We now have our requirements. Okay. When you're running Django stuff, there's a couple things that I want to cover in Django here before we start into the tutorial and kind of what it is in that regard. So let's come back to an overview. And so Django itself is meant to be extremely fast to get your developers up and going. Again, this is one of the core reasons that I use it as a primary backend. It is fully loaded. It includes all dozens of extras that handle your common web development tasks. This includes things like user authentication, content administration if you want to change the pages or change the backend. You can do sitemaps, RSS feeds, all that kind of stuff is really baked right into the platform and framework. It is secure, so that's one thing, you know, on the Flash side of things. If you don't specifically write your SQL commands, they're pretty susceptible to SQL injection or cross-site scripting, forgery. That is things that are all baked into a Django app. So the user authentication system pretty much handles all of that, handles all the username and passwords. You guys don't have to build tables and put all that. It's baked right into the main product. It's meant to be secure at scale. Let's see here. And you can do quite a few things with it on that side too. So let's go back to the documentation. There's going to be some tutorials and things we're going to go through. There's a couple different layers that we're going to use within Django, and it starts with the model layer. So the model layer is where you will define what your table would have been inside SQL or your database, right? So we will build out models, and those models have a way for us to set different field types. When you set those field types, it's going to set a pair of restrictions. So say, in Flask, we had things like integer 32 or integer 47 or text, right? In these different field types, it's going to set restrictions. For example, if we want them to be blank or we want a choices option, we could feed it a list or a dictionary of choices that they would have available for that. And then we can also set in all sorts of different types that are down here. The beauty of that is when it builds it into a web space, if you set it to a email type, it will automatically double check for everything that's email valid. Is it a valid domain? Does it have the @ symbol? Does it have the correct connotation? All of that automatically gets built out in your web pages. You don't have to write JavaScript for that. You don't have to import a third-party package to do all that testing. It's automatically baked into there. If you set something to a big text field versus a text area field, big text field is going to give you a nice little single line drop in, kind of like this search option up here. Where if I tell it text area, it's going to give me a big block. When I add that to my website, I don't have to adjust it and tell it to give me a big box or, max of 500 characters. It automatically adjusts all those things on the fly. It's based off the database. So lots of error checking, lots of making sure that the data sanitization that's coming in or data validation is all baked in based off the model and the field types that you set it at. We'll do queries, and the main thing I wanted to show up here was your migration. So that's one thing we talked about in Flask was when we made changes to our database, we had to essentially rewrite it or edit a bunch of those manually in order to update them. In Django, you would create what's called a migration. And so if I added something to my model, I would run Django make migrations and then migrate, and that essentially creates little SQL schema files that would automatically get ran when you check out the project. So the idea behind that is you don't have to think of everything ahead of time. You just have to add little migrations along the way. And then when I build your project, it takes all your migrations, squashes them all into one, and I can start the project. So no matter where you're at in the project, you can make changes on the backend database. If you make changes past the original one, you just have to set a default option. Now, when you go through and do your model, it's a good idea to set that anyway when you're going and building that out. So it will help you set a default for those that already had a value in that area. Then, much like in Flask, we had a view layer. This is where you essentially write your pages or the routes that we set up in Flask. Same concept here. You're going to set up your views. There's some built-in views like the admin page and some other stuff that's automatically in there. You can use some shortcuts and the decorators. They can be class-based views. So if you want to build in certain editing, you can generate CSVs and PDFs all based off there. It's all kind of baked in. And then you have the ability of using middleware. We will talk about that a little bit in this class. I don't want to dive too deep into the middleware. But what that would allow you to do is add like certain security packages to your Django app. If you need some robust security at some layer, you can actually import that content in. It's kind of like a plugin type style. And that's usually in the middleware or the other apps that you bring in. And then the last layer is your template layer. This is where you would build out your templates for your pages. Very similar structure to what we did in Flask. But there's a whole API and things that we can pull in order to get them in. Forms, like we talked about before, when you build out your forms for this, you now have built-in widgets that will automatically detect what type of widget you would want. So if you want radio buttons or drop-downs of database information in there, you can easily choose those options in there. It's kind of like having Bootstrap built into the module itself. It will automatically generate those. Now, you can use Bootstrap over the top of all this to give it some more fanciness, or Tailwind, or any of the other ones out there. But for the most part, it's really, really slick in there. What's real cool is if I built out a model, say, for example, our blog one that we did in Flask, when I bring that model into my template, like I import it and send it to it, I don't have to build a form for it. I just say form, and then point to the model, and it will automatically build the form for me. So it will define the fields that were already in there, determine what data set types they were, and then start generating the fields automatically. I can override those. I can set that. I can do form sets, which allows me to have, you guys have seen this when you're filling out information on a website. You'll have a block of inputs up here, and then you'll scroll down. You'll have a block of inputs down here. That information may be stored to a couple different tables in the database. That's what form sets allow you to do. And then during the development process, we run a little local server. We'll talk about that in the Django side. And then the key piece is you have this admin backend, and this is a great way to visually see all the stuff that's being stored in the database through the UI. It also gives you an interface for you to add users to your system, edit users, trim users. There's a whole lot of exporting you can do. It's really, really cool. On the security front, again, baked in, you already have some clickjacking protection, your cross-site forgery stuff. So when you build out all of this, it's kind of built in. You remember in Flask, we had to import specific packages in order to make sure that we didn't have any cross-site forgery stuff. It does have internationalization and localization built in, which means when you write this, you can set the localization as set for English. And then if somebody pulls it up in a different location, it could actually transcribe some of that using the browser. So it'll tell the browser you're using this. Or if you're using time zones and you want it to automatically adapt to whatever time zone they pull up or the time displayed there, it will adjust that as well. That's pretty slick if you're like, say you're doing a bunch of logging for us in cybersecurity. We do a bunch of log entries to the database. We can actually set the time zone based off where they're coming from in that format so that they could either select it in the app or you could rely on the browser to tell them what time zone it's baked in. Let's see here. Anything else that would be helpful? And then on the common web application tools, these are things you can use during development. So there's ways to cache. If you want to send emails, there's tools that you can import for that, logging, pagination, the messages framework, which is very similar to the messages framework we had in Flask. We can set up our sessions, static files, you essentially have the core things with a whole lot of other functionality on top. All right. So I can sit there and read that stuff till we're blue in the face and kind of give you a description of what's in there. Best part is just jumping right into the tutorial and then we talk about it as we go. All right. So the way a project is built is you start with a project itself, and then inside that project, you will have a app that will run in there. It's an app equivalent in Django is the equivalent of a blueprint that we did inside Flask. So to get started, when you're doing a Django project in general, you would want to go into whatever your folder is, and then we want to run this Django admin command, and that will start the website, and we will create this Django tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And by the way, if you click on the Windows side, it would tell you how to do it. It's the same thing. We're good here. So we're going to grab that, come down here to our Django, and paste this straight in. All right. Why did the virtual environment not come in? Oh, I got to create the folder so that it knows what to shove it into. Let's see if it pulls it up here. There. Okay, so now we got our Django tutorial up here. And then I run our make project and it built that out. So when you run your project, it's going to build all these different sites out there. And it starts with one called My Site. And then inside My Site, you're going to have your init files. You'll have your ASGI and your WSGI. These are files that you won't necessarily edit, but it's meant for when you get to production. For our case, we're just going to be running the development server. It has its settings files. This is a pretty big overall settings file that you will tweak and adjust as we go. What's nice about this settings side is that you can have it import environment and variables. For example, it generated this secret key that you see here. We could have a environment variable that sets this, or by default, it sets the debug to true. We would need to change that if we were going to production. Extra apps that we create, this will be the section for that. Middleware, this is what I was talking about before. This is like the security packages and things that we're using in the middle. Our template directory, and then what application we're building this out for. And then by default, we have our databases. And I talked a little bit about this during Flask for Django. The idea behind Django is you do not have to write specific commands for SQL or any of the other ones. When you build out your models, it comes back here and determines what engine it's going to be using to translate that out to whatever in database, right? So if we come out here, and what's nice is it always gives you a link to the actual documentation. So if we look at the documentation for the databases, just didn't paste there, just pull it up here and look at our databases. There we go. You can see that by default, it's going to support Postgre, MariaDB, MySQL, Oracle, or SQLite. And SQLite is the one we're going to use just because it's a simple flat file there, very similar to what Flask was doing. But if you were in production, you may very well want to connect this up to like a Postgre database and run that on the backside. All right. Let's see. So that looks good. So we have this site project. We have all those files. Again, this will give you another description of what I was talking about on that side. For the development server, what's nice is you can run this pretty smoothly. So if we go back to this and then to our tutorial, we're at here. Let's do a CD into our Django tutorial page or folder rather, and we can see this manage.py. So this manage.py is kind of what we will use to run our server and such. There's usually nothing you ever change in this. It's just a command that you're running for on this side. So you would do something like Python manage.py and then something like run server. All right. Run server is the equivalent of what you guys did with Flask. And then you did Flask -- app, whatever the name was, run. This is the equivalent of doing that. When you build that out, you'll be able to come over here and click on this URL, and you will see that we actually have Django installed and up and running. All right. Now note the default port for this is 8,000. Does anybody remember what Flask was?
5,000.
Good work. 5,000. That may or may not be a midterm question. So yes, Django is always going to run on 8,000. Flask runs on 5,000. You'll notice when we first launch this, it's going to tell us down here that you have 18 unapplied migrations and that you need to add those migrations to get those set up and running. So you'll add migrations and then migrate. What that's doing is setting up the backend for auth, admin, auth, content types, and sessions. These are pre-built out tables that go with every single Django project, right? So when I ran this, you'll notice this SQLite database got created, but you'll notice nothing's in here at this point. So we need to run the migrations, which will actually create that SQLite database. Okay. So when we come in here, the cool thing about run server in this case is if I make a change to any of the files, particularly any of the Django files, not HTML files or anything like that, but if I change models, if I change the views, etc., it will detect that change and automatically reload the server. All right. Another thing we can do is shut this down, and I encourage you to do this on this side, is come up here to your current file, edit configurations, add a new configuration, and we want to make sure we are using a Django server. Up here at the unnamed, we can call this our tutorial. And then down here, we want to choose our working directory, which would be the Django tutorial. Select that. And then if we had an environments file, we can point to that here. We're not necessarily worried about that. Leave it on port 8,000, running with our local system. Let's see here. We also want to enable Django support for this project. This is kind of a PyCharm specific thing. So if we click Fix, it's going to allow us to enable Django support, in which case we need to point to the root of our Django system, which would be here. Select folder. We need to point to our settings file, which is in the tutorial my site settings. In the manage.py, we want to point to that script. Tutorials manage.py. Any environment variables we want to set. In this case, we don't really have anything. Hit apply and OK. Now we can hit apply on this side, hit OK. And if we hit run up here at the top, You'll notice that it goes ahead and launches that system for us. And then if we wanted to add debugging, things like that later, it's going to give us a little bit more information. What's cool over here on the left, you'll notice this Django structure popped up. And so now it knows about our Django structure. So if we go to admin, we can look at our classes, our views, everything will start to populate over here as we work out. Again, that's the nicety of Django, or I'm sorry, PyCharm Pro, is that you get the ability to work directly with the Django structure. So if I wanted to create a new app, I can do correct links, I can view things, expand it. It's kind of building some niceties when you start using a lot of that in here. Okay.
Hey,
So
Jason,
yeah,
on that port 8000, that seems to be a fairly common port with some web
yep,
tools.
yep.
As long as this is just running by itself, like the other tools aren't running at the same time, that should work, right? I shouldn't have to change that port number.
No, it's only if on for whatever reason you're running something else on 8000 on your laptop or your desktop or whatever, just come in here and edit your configuration and then change this from 8000 to say 8001 or something. That will allow you to start it up on 8001.
And then that would be something that I'd want to add to the README if I had to do that, right?
You would, but if you just need to run it locally on your system, I would encourage you to leave it at 8000 by default. And then if a user needs to change it, you could write that in the README to edit the run command. So that way,
Okay.
all you're telling them to do is run that initial command that we did over here, which is Python manage run server. If they need to run it on a different port, they just literally put it on a different port here. So 8001, we'll start it on 8001.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, so that should get us up and running on the run server. And so now that that's started, we want to go ahead. We have our project. We need to create the first app in there. And again, an app is like the equivalent of a blueprint that we did within Flask. So the main difference, and this is where some people struggle, so I want to highlight this section here. The difference between a project and an app is a web application that does something, a blog system, a database of public records, or maybe a small poll app like this. A project is a collection of configuration and apps for a particular full-blown website. A project can contain multiple apps, and apps can be used in multiple projects, meaning you can use other people's apps in your project. You just have to import them in. Usually it's a pip install, Django, something, right? The idea behind that is that you can write little small apps that are universal across maybe multiple of your websites. But the project is that given collection of all those apps to make a functioning website. Anybody have any questions on that? I know it's confusing in the beginning, so. Okay. So now what we want to do is come in here and start our app for polls. So we'll copy this line. Yeah, just be Python there. Come in here and we'll paste that in below. And that will create a polls. You'll notice down here inside my site, right below that, you will now have a polls folder. It starts off with a migrations folder. Again, this is all the changes that you're going to be doing on the database. Nothing's in there at this point, but we'll show you what that looks like when you do get them. You have an admin.py. This is where you will register the models that you want to be able to edit with your admin interface. There may be some that you do or don't, but this is where you will set up or make any tweaks to the entire backend of your admin page. Under apps, you will list this one, which we have here, which is just the polls app. It's created by default. You have our models app. This is where we set up our models, essentially our database structures that we're going to be storing information into. Tests allow us to run tests. This is kind of like what we talked about in Flask, where it was kind of building out test case so that we can make sure that everything's populating correctly. And then under views, this is where you create what was basically routes in Flask. This is where you create the Python that says this page, if you want to go here, and then here's what you do on a get, here's what you do on a post. All of that kind of stuff is what happens in views. Again, that's separate than my site, which actually has the overall site settings. Okay. There's some other files that we'll create as we go along here, but those are the main ones we want to edit out. So we want to make sure that everything looks like this in our structure. We have that. Looks good. So the first thing we want to do is write our first view, basically an index page, in this case, a simple hello world. So we're going to look at our views inside of polls and our views. And we'll get this first one set up here, and then we should probably do a commit. So we're going to copy this code, and then let's take a look at that code. Oops. Go. So from Django HTTP, this is a library that's built in, and we can go and read about this in the views documentation. But in this case, we're going to do a very simple HTTP response page. We're not using an HTML template or anything else. We're just going to write this message on the screen. If you remember back in Streamlit, we used STWrite, and it just wrote it on the screen. Very similar function within Django. So for our index page, we want to return just the simple text, hello world, you're at the polls index. Okay. Once you create that, we need to create a URL. And so we don't have a URLs file inside of this. We're about to create one, but we do have a URLs folder that is here inside of the site. This is where you set up your actual paths that people will go to. So for example, if they go to admin/, it's going to set up all the admin URLs. And that's something that's baked into Django. We're about to create a new one for our polls. So if we look at this, we need to create a urls.py in our polls. Let's do that. So under our polls, let's create a new file called urls. And we'll paste this in. Again, what this is doing is setting up a path so that if you go to the root directory, notice there's no slash or anything here, that we want to point you to the index function that's listed in the views file, all right? And the name we set up is index. That's what's just going to be referenced. So anytime we call for index, it's going to point to the index function that's set up over here in our views, just like this, right? So this part maps to this part in the URLs. This is the views file. That's the reason you see views dot here. Note that we are importing that file up here. So from local directory, import views here. We can see that they're in the same folder. That's why we use this import structure. And we have this basic URL. Now what we need to do is go modify the site URLs so that it knows to include our polls URLs. It's, again, like the blueprints. Remember, blueprints had all of its stuff in one page in Flask. In this case, we have the same thing in Django. We want our overall one to have that. So we will modify the site URLs, and you're really just adding this little line up here at the beginning. And we want to put those in that order. So making sure that it's up at the top. So let's tab that in there. And you'll notice, and this happens a lot when you copy and paste stuff, that if you have this red squiggly line, you probably forgot to do one of those on your imports. And if you go back here and look, sure enough, we have a slightly different import. We're adding an include in there. So I'm just going to copy and paste it in, and that squiggly mark will go away. So when you guys are trying to troubleshoot or see something weird like that, you probably forgot to do an import here in the process of copy and paste. All right, so that path function is going to expect two arguments. It wants a route and a view. That's what we're seeing here. The route that we want to go to, and then the view that's associated with it. The include function is going to reference other URL config files. In this case, we're pointing to our polls.url. And so whenever Django encounters that includes, it chops off whatever part of the URL matched up to that point, and then sends the remaining string to the included URL conf, meaning that when it grabs our main website and we have a polls.index, or we go to the index page, it's going to send anything with polls/ over to that URL file. And then from there, because we have this set up as the root or with no slash in there, it's going to refer it over to our index page. Okay. So with that all set up, we can go ahead and run our server here. And when we come to the main page, you'll notice that we get nothing, right? Remember, we did not set up an index at the main server. We set up an index under the polls app. So if we go to polls, I can can spell correctly here, polls, hit enter, you'll notice that we get the index page there. And that's that real simple HTML response of what we got on this side. All right. So kind of like when we did hello, if you remember that over here on Flask, if you try to go something right now, it's going to give you some pretty detailed information. This is because we have debug turned on. You absolutely don't want this on in production because this will say, hey, you know, I tried going there, but I don't have anything that lists out the entire directory structure of your website. Not great in production, right? It's good for troubleshooting, but not great for production. If we were to go to admin, you will see by default, we get an admin login page. All right, this is already baked into the app. We would have to create a user in order to start using this. So right now there is no username and password because we haven't created one. We'll get into that here in a little bit. All right. Anybody have any questions on this so far? All right, cool. We're going to go ahead and do a commit up here. So I'm going to stop this server. And we're going to grab all these files that we created along with this URLs. Do a little quick update here. Okay, that all seemed to push. If I come over here, now if you notice over here under views, we have under our polls one, we have our index file. And if I double click, it will take me straight to that views file and right at that point where that index is. So this, as we start to tree things out, is pretty cool because you don't have to chase it down through your directory structure as to which one's which, especially when I have a URLs in my website and I have a URLs down here in this app. Things start to get really confusing really quick. And when you open them up here, it just says URLs, right? So if I close this and just open URLs, I just have URLs. I don't know which one I'm in. If I open up both of them, then it will go ahead and say, oh, this is the polls URL, this one's the my site URL. That's easy enough. If I close one, it sticks around and tells me that. But if you just open one and you start editing a bunch of stuff, you're like, oops, you don't know which one you're in. So by using this structure over here, as you start to build out more apps and other things, use this to double click so that you get the right file that you're trying to edit. Okay. All right. So now what we want to do is take a little bit of a look at our settings file, and we're going to play a little bit with our databases. Again, by default, the databases configuration is going to use SQLite. That's that's the easiest one to use. And again, it allows us to actually see the database information right there in PyCharm. So we're going to use that for the time being. There's that section of installed apps that I mentioned. As we create apps, we have to add that. So for our case, we'll end up adding polls here in a little bit. But we need to make our migrations in order to actually populate this database. So to do that, we open up our terminal and we're going to run a very similar command here. We're going to run make migrations. And at this point, nothing is going to need to be made because they're already there for the main website. So what we're going to now run is migrate. And that is going to apply all these little migrations that were pre-built into the system for setting up the backend auth system, the admin system, content types, that kind of stuff. If we look at our SQLite database now, we go ahead and need to create a connection just like we did before. There we go. We're good. Hit apply and OK. And then over here on the DB side, main tables, you'll see just by default in Django, we have 12 tables that have been created. Okay, so we have our auth user, and that auth user, if we look at those columns, we'll have all sorts of information that's stored on there. One of those is something like is staff or is active. That allows us to add them to specific user groups. So if you notice in auth user groups, we have the ID, the user ID, and the group ID. Lots of foreign keys that are pointing back to other places here. All of the user permissions, group permissions, we can set all of that without having to create it. Django gives that ability for us. The Django admin log, we actually store anytime somebody logs in with the admin and makes any changes. That's stored right there in the database. And then the overall Django session stuff is also stored in here as well. So we need to create one eventually here for our polls and all the information associated with it, but we had to set up these little migration files. If we go and look at those, which I don't think we can see that, nope, they're hidden by default there. We're going to see one here in just a little bit with polls and see what one of these files looks like. Okay. So we've done our migrate. That gets us set up and going, and that's going to allow us to pull information out of the database. We now need to create our own tables. In this case, we call them models, which will help with our database layout and then any metadata that we want associated with that little piece. All right. Django follows this DRY principle. I do want to highlight that. And these are design philosophies. All right. So DRY is a distinct concept in which a piece of data should live in only one place all the way through. One and only one place as it goes through. Redundancy is actually bad. Normalization is good. So the framework within reason is meant to deduce as much as possible from as little as possible. Meaning, if you create it in one spot, don't try to duplicate it in other spots. Be very explicit and reuse that information or foreign key it back to the same place. Right. And little projects you guys use, this isn't a big deal, but when you start to get into really large projects, there's no sense in restoring the same data over and over. So when you do your design, you really want that to kind of work where it shines there. Okay, we'll cover that in more detail. So in our little poll app, we want to create two models. One is going to be for all of our questions. The other one is going to be the choice that comes in there. The question itself model is going to have the question text as well as the publication date that that question was published. In our choice section, this is where we're going to have it associated with a given question. And you'll notice that we use a foreign key back over to our question. We have our choice text. In other words, we're going to use a char field, a character field that has a length of 200 max on the choice. And then on the vote section, this will be an integer field that starts at 0. Okay. This information, frankly, this is where you will spend most of your time when you first design your database, is right here in your field types, making sure that you're picking the right one as you go through there. Or if you need information on what types are out there, you would want to see this. So for example, we have a char field, which is a string field that allows for small to large size text strings. For large amounts of text, we would use a text field. This ends up forming a widget of a text area, which allows them to be able to see that when they enter a bunch of information. So there's also a bunch of different things that you could use here. So you may choose one to be something specific, and then you may want to change that later to get better input. You'll notice in char field, you have extra arguments like max length. We set that in ours to 200. And also a database collation. We're not dealing with that in our size. There's things like date time fields, which will automatically build a calendar widget inside of there, decimal fields, integer fields, 64-bit, not file bit, email fields, file fields. If you want them to be able to upload a file, you can use this simple file field and it would store that information right there in the database. So lots of different ones that you'll want to work through here to figure out which one's the best. If you use IP address fields, for example, this will actually have limitations to make sure that this is set up in a true IP version 4 or IP version 6 type setup. Again, it's doing all of that data validation and authentication for you, right? It gives you a simple text input, but if you don't put in a valid, RFC 4291 type IP address, you're going to have that issue in there. So, okay. Let's go ahead and copy this. And this is going to go into our models field, or our models page rather here. And so again, to make sure we're understanding what we're doing here, we're creating two tables. We have a question table, which will have a series of questions in it. we'll have a choice table, which is cross-referenced with questions. In other words, my choices are dependent on the question that comes in. And so in this case, we have a question underneath here that maps back over here to this model. And then we have the text of whatever that choice option is, and then how many people have voted on that particular choice. Again, we're setting this at 0 to start. Our pub date is using a date time field, and we're going to label that as our date published. And our question text itself is limited also to 200. All right. Let's see, we talked about that. That all looks good. We now need to add our polls app up here at the top. So we're going to copy this line, come into our settings, and under our apps, we want to always put our new stuff at the top. So we're going to move our polls and move it up here at the top to save that. Okay. Now that we created our models, right, you'll notice in the database, nothing is here yet. We need to make migrations, which in this case is going to generate a bunch of SQL code to dump into the database. So if I come in here and run make migrations again, it detected that there's migrations for polls, in which case it set up an initial.py and then created 2 models inside of it. If we run migrate, it will actually run any of those migrations. And if we see over here in our table, this should refresh shortly. If not, we may force it to refresh. There it is. And you'll notice it created our polls choice table with everything inside of it. And we also should have our polls question right below it with those particular options inside of it. Now, if we come over here to migrations, you'll see this initial file in here. If I double click that, you'll notice it created a migration. It has all the options in which it should be setting that up and running. And in the backside, if you were to look at this, it would generate a SQL commands that would actually inject that information into the SQLite database. Again, the reason it's written in this way is it's obfuscated. It is not tied specifically to SQL until we actually run this command. So this command goes, okay, I'm grabbing this. I see in your settings, you're tied to a SQLite database. Here are your SQLite commands in order to create that in the database itself. No more schema file that has to be properly structured and set up specifically for SQL. This Django kind of obfuscates all that and makes that very easy for you to adapt to. All right, so now that we got that working, let's do another small commit. Now you do want to commit this initial one here. And what that will do is when your user pulls it down, it will automatically have those migrations in there. So the first time they run make migrations and then migrate, it will have their app set up exactly the way you have it. Let's do tweak here, and then we'll commit and push. Great. If we notice over here in our Django structure, now under models, we have 2 of them under the polls section. And again, if I double click these, it will take me straight to those individual models so I can make tweaks or edits if I choose to. So it's really, really helpful to have that little structure over here on the left. All right. Now, I ran make migrations overall. You could just run it directly on the polls app if you chose to do that. Either way, you're going to get the same result there. So no problem. If you were to run SQL migrate polls 001, this would tell you exactly that SQL format that it's running on the backside. You'll notice that this matches very closely to what you guys had to do in a schema file, right? So you have your create table polls question, the ID field, big integer, not null, primary, all this stuff is automatically generated on this side here. Okay. And we ran our migrate, we're good there. And so now everything's up and running. We actually need to be able to pull information out of our database or see something. Now, you can interact directly with Django itself. It has like a free little API that you can use to do this from the shell. This isn't my best way of interacting with it. I like to go straight to the database and see what's in the database using PyCharm. But you could use this setting here in order to kind of interact with your app on the fly if you wanted to test something or add something on the back end. So to follow along with what they're doing here on this database AI, I'm going to put these side by side here. And then down below here, we are at this prompt. And so we would run something like Python manage.py, and we run a shell command. All right. So this is like an interactive Python shell that we have inside of here. We need to import the objects and everything that we want it to pull in. So for example, if I was to run question.objects.all, you'll notice that I get nothing back. And that's because we haven't imported the question model. So we would go from Django.utils, import time zone. And then from, whoops, did I not do that correctly? Nope, we're good there. And then from here, we're going to set up a queue object, which is pulling from a question. So from our question, and this is actually, we're setting one, right? We're doing this all from the command line. We will set the question text equal to what's new. And we're going to set our pub date equal to our time zone dot now. And so that sets the local time. All right. Hit enter. It looks like it took it. We always need to save it, just like what you guys did in Flask. You had to have the commit option. Same way here. So queue.save. That saved it to the database. If I look at my queue object and look for its ID, I now have a 1. If I say queue.question text, I can see I can get the text back out of it. If I want to look at the pub date, I can see the date time object that comes out of there. I would have to convert that in order to pull that out. If I want to get all my questions back as a list, I could do our question.objects.all. And you'll see I get a query set back of all those questions. And I could save that to a variable and then do some modifications on that side as well. That doesn't really look very clean as we're trying to go through there. So what we can do is go back to our model. And we have this here, right? Notice it returned this really unhelpful string here. We can set a function in here called default string, which will allow us to always see what we're coming back with. So in this case, we're going to copy these 2 lines. And in here, if we call this question object, by default, we want you to return that question text. So now if I save that, and over here, if I do our question objects all, I'll actually have to rerun the import there. Let's do this also on our choices. Notice that this time we want to come back specifically to our question text. All right. And then in our models, we need to add that time zone now so that we have a customized time zone coming in there. Because right now we're just using whatever date time that we're coming in with. So if we return this section here, we can run a function in this section. What was that called there? Yeah, question. This gives us an option to see if this was published recently, which means it's going to take the current date time and then subtract 1 day ago. So is it within the last 24 hours? We can then determine whether or not, if that was returned here, if that pub date is returned within 24 hours, we now have this ability to run was published recently. So you can build out all these little functions and this will start to make more sense as you go. Notice that I did not import my date, time, and time zone. So I need to come back here and grab that. There we go. And that should finish out that side. You'll notice that we also don't have date time, so we need to import date time directly. And then date time is covered there too. Okay. So now on this side, if I was to pull this back, let's see here. And again, I run that same question. I get this query set that comes back out of there. I could also run a filter on here as well, meaning I could do something like question dot objects dot filter, and we want to filter based off the first question that's in there. So ID equals 1, hit enter, and I get back that query object inside of there. Again, it's not helpful because we don't know what that looks like. If I run this query filter against something where the question text starts with equals what's or what, then it will go pull the actual, whoops, I forgot my parenthesis. We can see that it actually pulled back to that same question there as well. So you could do all sorts of commands. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you can interact with the command line, and heavy end developers will do this when they first test out things, or if they need to see what kind of results they would get back, this would work. I have found, because we have access directly to the database, I can come in here and look at my choices. I can also look at my questions right here in the database. It's a whole lot easier to see what we get resolved here. Now, the benefit of doing something like this is if I want to just pull a subset from the database and not a huge thing, I can run that command down here to see what subset would actually get returned, right? So for example, here, I looked for a subset of any of the questions that start with the word what. There may be more than one of those, and it would return multiple of those objects back out to me. All right. Let's see here. We're at 238. We'll finish out this little section here on the admin side because that's pretty helpful, so that we can interact with what's on the backend database anyway. So to interact with this, we have to create an admin user. We can go ahead and quit this, by the way. We need to run a super user command. This is something that you would have to put into your README when we get going. So Python manage.py create super user. And so for our username, we're going to do something like, say, admin, and then don't worry about an email address, set our password. In this case, it's really mad that I set the password back to admin. You could set this to whatever you wanted to. We want to bypass this one for this purpose, hit Y and then enter. What that will do is when we run this website now, let's go out here to our local one here, and we do a /admin. We get our login. In this case, I set mine to admin. I can now, in this UI, be able to adjust all my users, and I can see my admin user that's created here. I can create groups. I can associate users with groups, but I have this nice, clean admin interface in order for me to edit everything inside of it. So it's really, really slick to look at the back end. Notice that I can't edit my questions or my polls in here, all right? So to do that, what I have to do is make them available to the admin package, or the admin portion of this. And so to do that, I come back here and I would edit this admin file. Close this down here. And then to set that up, I need to come down here to my admin, and I'm going to copy something that looks like this. And what that will do is allow me to bring in my admin. We're going to import from models. I just want my question. And then we're going to register the question here on the admin site. So if I hit save, you'll notice that the server automatically rebooted down here at the bottom. And if I come back to my admin site and hit refresh, I can now edit in the polls app. I can see my questions. All right. Same way with choices. If I wanted to add that down the road, I would say import choices, or choice rather, sorry. And then I would need to register that. Now the order in which I register it will also show me up on the website. So when I save that and it goes back, I hit refresh and you can see choices is coming up here. So I have choices and questions. And you'll notice I had choice at the bottom, then question. But when I look at the website, here, nope, there, choice came up beforehand. And by default, Django is going to do everything based off alphabetical order and A to Z. If you want to override that, you have to change and manipulate the default standards in there. So regardless of the way you have it set up in the pie chart, it's only going to do the default order in here, and everything is always set up in alphabetical order by default. You can change that. You just have to modify your admin file to overwrite that. Right. Now, we didn't set up any specific changes in here. So if I go to question, I can see the new question, what's new. And if I dive into that, I can see the date published in the question text. But what's nice about the UI is I can come in here and set the actual dates and times on things if I needed to modify it or change it. If I want to add a bunch of choices to that question, I would come in here and add, pick that specific question, and then have a choice text of something like apples, right? And leave our votes to simple, and I could do save and add another, and now we would go to new, and I could do something like bananas. E-A-N-A-N-A. Yeah, there we go. Add another one, and we could keep going through here and edit this up. If I needed to create a new question on the fly, I have this ability to click the plus sign, and it will allow me to add a brand new question right here. So I could say, what is a car? I don't know, just adding stuff in here. We would grab the current date time. I could click today and now. It would automatically fill it. And then now I have what's a car, and I could say vehicle, right? Save and add another. And now I have the option of what is a car, and I could add more and more options as we go through there. All right. To keep going with our particular one here, I want to remove those. So if I come over here and go to choices and then questions, I could go, what is a car? Actions, delete those questions and hit go. It asks for sure that I'm going to delete those. Let's do that. Go up to our choices and let's get rid of our banana stuff here too. And clean that all up too. Cool. Now, had we left stuff in there again on the backside on this, we could look at our database and we would see those extra questions show up here. We would see the extra choices show up here. But this UI way of manipulating and adding extra information is a whole lot easier. All right. Let's see here. Going back to the app, they're going to run you through those same kind of things and explain why that is. Notice that on that date published, we use a date time field. Therefore, it gave us the widgets to select right now for these, or we could click the calendar and adjust where we want to go. All right. So you get all this nicety of JavaScript and everything else inside of here of your little input widgets based off how we set it on the database. So because we set that as a date time field, Django knows, okay, I need to give them a date time option here. And if I want a different kind of option or a different widget, there's a bunch of other widget styles you could give it as well. All right. This is a pretty good stopping point. So I'm going to stop my website. Let's do a commit. And we're going to generate a nice commit message and push that out. Okay. So when we get back, we're going to be out here at part 3. This is where we're actually going to start building out web pages for the website itself. So there's a whole slew of these web pages that we have to build out. You got the home page, the entry page, which is going to be where they add an actual poll in. We can look at a year-based archive and display all the entries within a given year, a given month archive, day-based. There's all these different things that we can add out. And we can build these pages on the fly through our views. So what do you guys think so far between Flask and Django?
I like Django better.
How about
keep stopping and starting the program?
You got it. You got it. Sam, Jamie, what do you guys think so far?
I think for what I'm trying to do, Django is probably going to be the better tool.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're having anybody need to deal with the backend data or just view the data besides what's on the website itself, having that admin interface totally changed. Because otherwise you'd have to code that from scratch in Flask, right? Now, there's a time and a place. If your project doesn't need anything like that, well, then Flask is great. But by default, it's built right in there to Django. Now, you can customize this entire admin interface with a bunch of tweaks. I can have it to where I can have a multi-form edit in there. And so people on the back end can edit these different things. I talked about a restaurant inventory program, right? This is the back end that they use to add the different inventory in. But what gets displayed to the user when they have to check mark and display what's in there, they don't know that part, right? All they have to do is say, yes, it's there, and how many, what's the quantity, that kind of stuff. The end users come in here and actually would add those options in the inventory. If you want to design a report or you want to build out what's in your current inventory, all of that you could do within their Django administrative side.
So this is where I just got it.
Yeah. Yep. And then there again with the users and all of that, it already has the users with all permissions and setup, and all of that's kind of baked in. You don't have to create that from scratch.
Well, for my final, like, 'cause I want it, since I'm doing the mini thing, I want it, since if you guys do new items each year where you can add new items and all that.
You got it. Yep. Perfect. All right. I know this seems like it's fast. That's what the recordings are going to be there for. You can step back through all of it. It will take a full 2 weeks, just like it did in Flask. Again, I could spend an entire semester teaching you just Django, right? I'm trying to get you just enough pieces that you can get started in your project. Once you have a concept or idea, it really helps you map through. This is where things like ChatGPT work really well, and just saying, okay, you want to get started. Run this command to start your app, which you guys know what you guys need to do. Start your app, or start your site, start your app. Then I want you to fill in this information in the settings. You can then start to understand that I don't quite want it like that. I want you to build it like this. And then you can go in and modify those files and make those changes. A lot of this, you'll start, especially in the model section, start with the basic char fields. And then as you need to tweak it and make it more customized, then use the more specific one as you go. The problem with something like Django and ChatGPT is there's so many files. Like if you look here already, we already created how many files? A lot of files, and just doing the very basics of everything. So that's one nastiness of Django, is it's bulky. It's got a lot of pieces to it, but a lot of these right now are actually empty files, right? They're there, but they're empty. As you start to build out your project, they're all in little separate files. But as you guys learned in 360, that's kind of nice, having this compartmentalized so that you don't have one giant file like you do in Flask that you have to scroll through and figure out what section I need to update or what I need to change. All these files have a purpose in what they're doing there. All right, I will stop the recording.